this was the beginning of civil rights, probably birthed right there. And Martin Luther King, Quincy Newman, who was in Columbia,
Right.
were non-violent. They believed that they followed Gandhi, and he said that wasn't true. I consider myself a pacifist. So this is really an interesting question to me. Tubman, Hunter, obviously Saxton and Higginson did not feel that way. Could you speak to that at all, or maybe the opinion of that, or?
There had always been a difference of opinion in the abolitionist movement between those like William Lloyd Garrison, who wanted abolitionism promoted and slaves, let me back up. There had always been a difference of opinion in the abolitionist movement between the supporters of William Lloyd Garrison, who wanted violent actions against slaveholders. The masthead of his newspaper, The Liberator, stated, "No union with slaveholders." And those who wanted a more middle-of-the-road, ameliorative type of response. For example, even someone like Emerson raised the argument of freeing the slaves by buying them from the slaveholders and saying that Americans all over the North would raise up and said that Americans all over the North would rise up and contribute to the fund to free the slaves. The idea that they did deserve compensation for what was, in their minds, their property. Then there was the Back to Africa movement, which became known mainly in the late 19th century by Marcus Garvey, that held that the slaves should be shipped back to Africa where they could be free people again in their own country. Even someone like Henry Thoreau was attracted to this for a short time. As the century progressed, and as you had the annexation of Texas, and as you had questions over the boundaries of states, and as you had questions over slavery encroaching upon the rest of the country as the country expanded, it became obvious that a peaceful solution would not work. Emerson, when the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, wrote in his journal, "I will not obey this by God," because it was the South using the courts in the North to force people to work against their conscience. And this continued through the 1850s, through numerous incidents, treaties, events like the caning of Charles Sumner, to the point where it was impossible to argue for nonviolence anymore when you were dealing with a group of people against whom that did not work and who were being not necessarily demonized, but portrayed in the public's eyes as people who were violent themselves. I mean, when you have people enslaving other people and brutalizing them, it's hard to look at them as people who will respond to nonviolent actions.
That's just such an interesting,
It is.
and Lincoln said, even if we do this, it's going to take another 100 years. And then in 100 years, of course, there was much violence, but the main leaders were speaking nonviolence. So that's interesting. Let's see. I also wanted to talk about some of the other people that were floating around there, like Nathaniel Hawthorne, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Margaret Fuller kind of was already gone before that. And one of those things that's so interesting that I had read a long time ago, that a big statue of John C. Calhoun was coming back on the boat.
With Fuller. I think Hiram Powers statue, of Calhoun, yeah.
But I thought that was just an amazing story. So there was Hawthorne. There was who was Moby Dick?
Melville.
There was all of those people around in that same area, and could you sort of speak about the literature, Emily Dickinson, Longfellow, Walt Whitman?
Back up for a second in my mind. When you look at the so-called major writers of the American Renaissance, you have Poe, Hawthorne, Melville, Emerson, Thoreau, and Whitman. Three of them lived in Concord, either most of their lives or for a significant portion. That would be Hawthorne, Thoreau, and Emerson. Melville was from New York State and did live in Pittsfield, Massachusetts for a while before ending his life in New York City. Poe was a Virginian who disliked the Transcendentalist intensely. He would always talk about the Frogpondians, which was his name for the people in Boston because of the so-called frog pond in the Boston Common. And then you had Whitman, who was a Long Islander who spent most of his life in New York City. They all were part, though, of the communications network in the mid-19th century, where books were distributed, where pieces of literature were reprinted widely because it was less expensive and easier to reprint something from another newspaper or magazine than it was to commission and or pay someone to write something new. So literature was widely distributed at that time. Poe, for example, was an editor of newspapers and magazines. He was reviewing other people's books. There was a broad literary nexus of people at this period. Concord was a very special place. It was a special place before Emerson arrived there in the 1830s because it was the place where the shot heard round the world occurred. People in Lexington still dispute this, but Concord claimed the first battle of the Revolutionary War for themselves. Emerson's grandfather was part of that and, in fact, died as a minister dealing with the troops. His father owned a house that overlooked the North Bridge where the battle took place. His Aunt Mary Moody Emerson was a baby when that battle took place. Emerson was rooted to Concord because of those family connections. Henry David Thoreau was rooted to Concord for the natural scene. Hawthorne came to Concord because it was a place where he could write and also where other writers were as well. Hawthorne, however, was far more conservative. He was born in Salem, Massachusetts. I think he inherited a lot of the Puritanism of that town and was great friends with Franklin Pierce. They were classmates at Bowdoin. Hawthorne wrote a campaign biography of Pierce. Pierce rewarded him by giving him the consulship in Liverpool, England. So when Hawthorne wrote a book called Our Old Home in 1862, which was about his British experience, he dedicated it to Franklin Pierce, even though Pierce was excoriated by the people in Concord because of his pro-slavery stand. In fact, there's an anecdote that when Emerson received his copy of Our Old Home from Hawthorne, he tore the dedication page out.
Well, is there anything else that are kind of connections that you've made from looking at this? Were you very familiar with the Port Royal experiment prior to this?
A little bit because of the, what's the school that's down near Beaufort?
Penn School.
The Penn School, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things about Port Royal and also the Penn School was the number of New Englanders who volunteered to go down there and teach. It was putting ideas into practice. If you feel that people who are less advantaged than you are can be raised up by education, then you, in a sense, have to put your actions where your thoughts are. In some ways, this goes back to Rufus Saxton. If you believe in disunion, if you believe in freeing the slaves, if you believe in routing the South, then the way you do it is military action. It becomes a way to concretize an idea. In other words, you just don't pick it. You actually do something.
That's correct. That's what he did, and it's just like I said, it just amazes me. One of while we're looking through here at some of the side interests are that Higginson actually was, it says, was the editor of Emily Dickinson's poems.
Right.
that's very interesting to me. That's, of course, that's after the war, but
But he begins his correspondence with her before the war.
oh, really?
I'm almost positive of that.
Okay. Can you do you know anything about that, about him being?
It's a very tortured subject, of which there are many opinions. She wrote to him when he was a very influential magazine editor. The question is, did she write so she could get advice? Did she write so she could get published? Or did she write so she could get feedback on her poems? After her death, the family invited Higginson as a man of letters to come in and help edit her poems. He did, but being a man of letters in the late 19th century, what he wanted to do was to make her poems accessible. That meant eliminating her idiosyncrasies. So if there were idiosyncrasies in spelling, they were regularized. If there were idiosyncrasies in punctuation, of which there were many, because Dickinson used dash as sort of a omnibus punctuation mark. People still don't know whether it's supposed to be a dash, a comma, or a period. Those went out. So what was presented to the public in 1891, in the first series of her poems, was a poem that was formatted for an audience of the 1890s. And people have spent over 100 years trying to correct that impression.
Oh, wow.
In fact, there are two standard editions of Emily Dickinson's poems, one done by Harvard in the 1950s and one done in a more sophisticated fashion, I think about 15 years ago. So it's a very, very tortured subject.
But he did believe that she, I mean, it seems to me, it probably would be interesting to know if someone else had done it, but it seems like he was very supportive of her.
He was supportive of a lot of young writers. He was a man of letters. This is something that you don't realize unless you are in Boston. I was born in Brookline, so all these people were in the same orbit. Longfellow and Hawthorne were boating together. But most of the people we're talking about are Harvard graduates. All the transcendentalists, with the exception of Bronson Alcott and the women, were educated at Harvard College or the Harvard Divinity School. So they all knew each other, and their families were interrelated. So that you have, it's a large social group of people who know each other, who work with each other. I'm sure that Higginson must have known Charles Lowell and the Massachusetts 54th. So that these are people who were part of a community. It was part of an intellectual community, and they were members of the same clubs. They were alumni of the same college. They were people who ran in the same social circles. So it's a very interesting nexus of history, where the joke is the Saltonstalls talk to the Lowells, who talk to the Bancrofts, and so forth, and proximity. What would have happened if more people had gone west, for example? But they all stayed close to Boston.